Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, just how close are Israel and Hamas to reaching a ceasefire? Well, President Trump seems to think the two sides are very close indeed. That's under discussion in today's edition. Hello and welcome. A ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas could be reached this week. That's according to the U.S. President Donald Trump, who is meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington today. Meanwhile, negotiations are also underway in Doha, the capital of Qatar. Well, let's get more on all of this. So we can speak, first of all, to Manuel Hassassian, the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, who joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Ambassador Hassassian. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, sir.
Just let's start by talking about the talks going on at the White House. President Trump saying yesterday there's a good chance of a ceasefire deal being reached this week. Do you share his optimism?
Actually, let's go back to March, when the idea of a ceasefire, between Hamas and the Israeli government headed by Netanyahu was drafted, and there was a lot of, concerns among both parties about the implementation of those understandings. And since then, it has been tabled by Netanyahu for political expediency to create new facts on the ground, to deal with Iran, and to change, the course of negotiations from a more power politics perspective after, having clinched a deal with Iran. Let alone that the Trump administration has been very keen after, clinching the deal with Iran to put all its efforts now towards a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, I don't think there are new indications or new demands by both parties, except that they want to air the differences on the initial acceptance for a ceasefire. And we can see that the most difficult part in all this will be the question of the exchange of hostages and prisoners. There lies the devil in the details. But I can see that there is a certain kind of seriousness this time from the United States, especially from President Trump, that he wants to see a certain kind of a change on the Gaza war. And his intention is not only to have a ceasefire for 60 days, but to have a permanent ceasefire with certain conditions that could basically conform with the security arrangements of the Israelis, as well as trying more or less to create certain kind of stability by humanitarian assistance to Gaza, and to restructure the Gaza from a different perspective, rather than Israeli total control, maybe to Palestinian, to Arab control of Gaza, in the reconstruction of Gaza and the rehabilitation process of the Gazans. So I see seriousness, yes, this time. And the objective is not only for 60 days ceasefire, but to work the details for a permanent ceasefire. And I think, of course, Netanyahu is willing to a certain extent to go with the 60 days now, but not with a permanent solution, for the simple fact that he doesn't want to lose the coalition that he has, especially Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are not happy with the ceasefire. And of course, the Likud in general is not happy with the ceasefire. The army, is at a crossroad. They don't know whether they should reoccupy Gaza or not, or accept, a deal of withdrawal and the reconstruction of Gaza under different political circumstances. So things are a little bit still chaotic. But as far as having a ceasefire, I think there will be a deal this week, and I think Hamas is ready for that deal.
Okay, you made a lot of points there, Ambassador. Let me pick up on one of them. I mean, there is an impasse here, which is that Hamas says it wants a full end to hostilities before it releases any more hostages. Israel saying it won't stop fighting till all the hostages are free. I mean, how do we get around this?
I think if during this, interim period of, or what I call the prelude to a permanent ceasefire, I think it's important that the 2-month ceasefire will give ample time for both parties to mend their differences on the finality of the exchange of political prisoners and hostages. But in the meantime, for the first stage, like in the coming 2 months, I think the ceasefire has to have a certain kind of political exchange of prisoners and hostages, and there should be, access to humanitarian aid to the Gazans. That will break the ice and will create more conducive conditions towards more concessions on both parties, basically, to accept the deal. I say that from a holistic perspective, because we understand the complexity of the situation in Gaza, and we do understand that the only party that could really put pressure on both sides to accept the deal, let alone the partners to the United States, Qatar and Egypt, will be, plausible if we start with this stage, which I consider to be an ice-break stage to the finality of the conflict in Gaza.
With the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, President Trump at a certain point drew a line in the sand and said, enough. And that really ended the war. Can he do the same with Gaza, do you think?
Yes, I think definitely we can do that with Gaza. First of all, we have to understand the reality on the ground. Israelis have incurred a lot of losses in Gaza, let alone economically and what have you. Although they are the aggressors, the naked aggression came from Israel, continuously for the last almost 2 years now. It depleted its resources. It cannot really justify the continuation of war. There are no statistics whether Hamas is obliterated as they consider that will be their triumph over Hamas. There are no evidence that Hamas is finished in Gaza, let alone also Hamas under heavy attack, by the Israeli army, indirectly, directly, have also depleted its resources. So I think both parties came to a certain kind of a crisscross where the continuation of this war is going to be a war of attrition rather than a zero-sum conflict. And that's why the losses, on the Palestinian side is staggering. But also Israel has been paying a heavy price in terms of soldiers being killed, infrastructure, and what have you. So I think, this is the time where the United States is serious for the first time after the Iran deal to be more proactive in trying to put pressures now on Israel, let alone Hamas, to accept this deal as a precursor towards a permanent solution. We have to understand that Netanyahu has been procrastinating this process for a long time in order to establish his political grounds and not to face his fate going to prison because of his corruption and what have you. Now there are the options for Netanyahu are completely limited because the war in Gaza will still make the Middle East unstable, insecure, and strategically, the United States national interests won't be secured unless the war in Gaza is over once and for all, with the end of conflict and with the finality of this conflict, in order to look at certain strategic projects of how to rebuild and reconstruct Gaza towards a more secure society, let alone a secure Israel next to the Palestinian people and authority, of course.
All right, so what you're saying, Ambassador Hassassian, is that once the war stops in Gaza, once the fighting comes to an end, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a precarious situation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, he will be in a precarious situation, but he cannot continue with this policy of procrastination because the prices that Israel is paying is very high. The Americans are saying enough is enough. The Hamas still has a stronghold in Gaza. So we are in a total impasse. So the only thing that will change the entire game plan is the fact that a ceasefire should lead to a permanent ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli soldiers, and the entry of humanitarian aid with a perspective of who is going to control Gaza. And the best option has always been the Palestinian Authority.
Right. So you're saying the PA is going to step up and help run
Yes.
Gaza post-war. I mean, are you ready? Is the PA ready to take on that
Yes.
huge responsibility?
Yes. I mean, the PA has discussed the reconstruction plan with the IMF, with the World Bank, and of course, recently my foreign minister, Dr. Barsena Agabekyan, was here, and she discussed it also with the Danish government. We have a sound plan. Dr. Mohammed Mustafa, our prime minister, has put it internationally, and it has been, crisscrossing with that of the Egyptian plan of international, the international dimension of reconstruction. So there is a sound plan between the Egyptian plan and the Palestinian Authority plan, let alone it has sounded, very well accepted by the international community through the international organizations. And you have seen this with our, bilateral relationship with European countries that really, accepted the outstanding plan, which will take, it's like a 5-year plan for the reconstruction of the destroyed Gaza. So I believe that the Palestinian Authority is ready to assume that role with the help of maybe security-seeking force in Gaza, be it from Arab countries and what have you. And I think, it's doable.
But you wouldn't work with Hamas, would you? I mean, the PA would rule that out from the beginning. Is anything, what's actually left of Hamas at this stage? We've been told conflicting information.
Nobody can tell in numbers because, Hamas is an ideology. We don't know. Maybe many Palestinians, in Gaza attribute to this ideology. So we don't have militias of Hamas with numbers that we say, oh, they have dwindled to this number and that number. You're dealing with an ideology of fundamentalism. That's number one. Number two, I believe also Hamas, has been affected by this war. We cannot just omit the fact that they were not, hit hardly, during this war. And thirdly, Hamas has shown interest in not being part of the new administration in Gaza. They said it once and for all.
Okay, but do you think the PA would be accepted in Gaza if you say that a lot of people subscribe to the ideology of Hamas? Would they accept people from the West Bank coming in telling them how to run what they see as their territory?
First of all, you have to understand that in the West Bank, Hamas's influence is minimal. It's not like Gaza. And secondly, this war has changed many perspectives in Gaza because, for the last 15, 16 years, since 2007, 18 years, they have seen Hamas's authoritarian rule in Gaza. And many people want to see, a dramatic or a draconian change in the political system, in Gaza. And they are now more prone towards the Palestinian Authority to come, let alone the Palestinian Authority never abandoned Gaza in terms of monetary expenses, paying electricity, water bills, almost 3,000, no more, thousands of employees, public employees. Still, the authority used to pay more than 59% of its annual budget on Gaza. So the influence and the impact of the Palestinian Authority is still there. And many Gazans, now are reacting negatively against, the prolongation of this war. And they look that Hamas has worn out, politically, and of course, in terms of also militarily. So they're looking for new options. And they believe that the international community will support the Palestinian Authority in coming back to Gaza as a legitimate authority. And that's why I believe the Gazans are now more prone toward a ceasefire with a new construction and with a new perception of a government that is not purely based on Hamas's ruling system.
Okay, and just to wrap up, Ambassador, we keep hearing out of Washington this expression, a new Middle East. And I think by that they're talking about, normalizing ties, the view that more ties will be normalized between the Israelis and other countries in the region. What's your interpretation of this new Middle East?
Well, Netanyahu, let alone, President Trump, have never declined the idea of the Abrahamic Accords. And the Abrahamic Accords really worked well, basically, with certain Gulf countries. And I think the question of the ceasefire, the reconstruction of Gaza, the authority coming back, promoting the two-state solution again, the resumption of negotiations, the Saudis would play an imperative role. And I think the Saudis has the trump card now as far as trying to build relationship normalization with Israel. If Israel accepts now the finality of this conflict through negotiations and the establishment of a two-state solution. I think this is what President Trump looks at the new Middle East, factoring in the national interest of the Americans, because, the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis, and many other allied countries in BRICS are more and more now being entrenched in the policies of the Middle East and in controlling certain kind of what I would consider proxy groups and what have you. So the Americans want basically to circumvent that kind of influence in the Middle East region in creating a new Middle East that is based on security and stability. And the only way to achieve that is to find, a win-win situation where the two-state solution, which still the international community adheres to as the finality to this conflict and this occupation, is manageable and is doable, regardless that the onslaught of settlers and the expansion of settlements still will be, a major impediment to the finality of this conflict. But at least, the sooner the better. The settlement activities should be stopped. New conducive conditions should be created. Conflict should end. War should end. Withdrawal should be achieved. End of occupation means new self-determination for the Palestinians, and that's the way to go to process forward for the establishment of an independent Palestine. Without that, there will never be stability and security in the Middle East. And we have witnessed 6 major wars in the Middle East, and we haven't seen security and stability. Without solving the Palestinian problem, there will never be stability and security in the Middle East. And the Americans now are factoring this in their national interest in the Middle East region.
Okay, well, we appreciate you talking to us. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Manuel Hassassian. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
Well, from an American perspective, we're joined now by Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas, and joins us now. Greg, always a pleasure talking to you. Let me start by asking you just how hopeful you're feeling about a ceasefire deal being reached between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump today or this week.
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I think the president's been on a tear lately, with some really great successes, and then especially with the execution of the mission in Iran, taking out the nuclear facilities. And I think, Benjamin Netanyahu, has to understand the frustration that the president has with the process in Gaza. But I think this is really all about Hamas and whether Hamas will cooperate. I think Netanyahu for sure will cooperate with the president.
As you say, President Trump has been on something of a roll lately, and he must be feeling some of that momentum, at the end of the 12-day war, as you just mentioned there. Do you think he's got the last word on this? And do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu basically has to fall into line at this point? After all, it's been 21 months of warfare.
Yeah, look, I think this is different than when President Biden was in office, and President Biden was discouraging, even claiming, that Netanyahu could not do the things that he wanted to do, and Netanyahu went ahead and did them. So this is different because the president has much greater commitment and support for Israel and for Netanyahu on one hand. But on the other hand, the cooperation that you saw with the Israelis and the Americans in that 12-day war, won't last forever if the president feels it's a one-way street. So I think he's in a good place. I think the president's in a good place. I think Netanyahu's in a good place. And now it's just I think it's up to Hamas to cooperate, or the alternative, as President Trump has made clear, the alternative is much worse. And he made the same kind of, I'll call it a threat. He made the same kind of threat to Iran, to the regime, the mullahs, and they did not cooperate. And look what happened after the 60-day deadline passed.
So you don't think it's accurate to say that perhaps President Trump is a bit more enthusiastic about the idea of a ceasefire deal than Prime Minister Netanyahu is?
Well, yeah, look, I think, Netanyahu has experienced the difficulty of dealing with Hamas, and they've not cooperated with, even with the hostage exchanges, last year, they turned them into these propaganda events, really. And so I think, there's definitely frustration with Netanyahu. Nobody wants this war, but he understands that Hamas will continue to fire missiles at Israel. He's taken care of, for the most part, taken care of Hezbollah or weakened them deeply. Syria is no longer an immediate threat, and of course, he's handled, along with the U.S., he's handled the Houthis as well. So, I don't think that they want to fight anymore if they don't have to. But I think if Hamas doesn't cooperate and they continue, jeopardizing the lives of their citizens and using them as human shields, it leaves Netanyahu with little choice. And I think President Trump will understand that. I think President Trump wants peace. He's definitely an anti-war president. But I understand. I think he will sympathize with Netanyahu.
I mean, Netanyahu's got some hardline coalition partners, and they do not seem to want a ceasefire at all. What do you think the Trump administration makes of that element of the Prime Minister of Israel's sort of supporting coalition?
Yeah, again, I think the president will do everything he can to stop the war and bring peace to the region. But he also understands that the hardliners are frustrated because they've from experience realized that the only thing that will work here ultimately is eliminating Hamas. And so I think if Hamas were smart, they would cooperate so that they won't be eliminated and we can have peace sooner. I mean, the killing goes on, and it's horrible to see. And I think President Trump understands that. But the alternative is Hamas continues to use their people as human shields and harass Israel. And I do think, in this case, I think clearly President Trump and Netanyahu are on the same side here. And I think that will continue unless there's some surprises that we don't anticipate. But I think, he's trying to get peace to the table. So far, so good, in terms of the success of the 12-day war and the success that Israel has had, or the IDF has had, in almost, I wouldn't call it eliminating Hamas, but surely limiting their capabilities. But this is the time for Hamas to step up and end the hostilities.
And just lastly, Greg, before we let you go, I mean, we keep hearing from people in Washington, senior figures in the Trump administration, talking about what they call a new Middle East. I just want to ask you what the new Middle East looks like. What does that expression mean to you?
It's a great question, Tom. And I think what the new Middle East looks like is the Abraham Accords and economic cooperation. Peace through business, not peace through strength necessarily. I mean, we need obviously military strength and the strength of deterrence. But President Trump in the first term with the Abraham Accords was, a great step in the right direction. I think you'll see more Abraham Accords signed in even the near future. And of course, you've had the proposal that from some of the Emirates, that the proposal from some of the sheikhs in the region that have proposed, creating sort of an emirate structure. And I think that's something that the president could embrace, really. But overall, it's bringing economic ties, peace through business, and not continued wars here. So I think he's got a great platform to lean on that started in the first term and will continue.
All right, we really appreciate your time and your analysis. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republican Overseas.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks again, Tom.
Well, let's get more now. We can cross to Gidi Grinstein, who is a former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Thank you so much for being with us. You were, of course, involved in the negotiations with the PLO and Yasser Arafat in the early 2000s. You're also part of the Camp David summit in July 2000. So that's almost a quarter of a century ago. I think in a couple of days' time, that anniversary will be met. I mean, clearly, President Trump is pushing for a ceasefire. Are you confident that one will be delivered and one will be agreed on this week?
First of all, Tom, thank you very much for having me again on your show. I do think this is an historical moment. It's the most plastic moment in the Middle East since 1917, and the Middle East can be shaped in over the next few months for decades, potentially for decades to come. I think we can see very serious commitment by President Trump and his team to reaching a war-ending deal in Gaza, which will unlock the ability to create normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which then opens up a whole additional range of possibilities. I would also mention, I'm almost certain that they're talking about Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. So they have a very busy agenda between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump this week in Washington.
You say the most significant moment since 1917. I mean, obviously that was the time of the British campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. What's so significant about what's happening now? I mean, that's more than 100 years worth of significance you're saying here.
Yeah, so basically 1917, the First World War is coming to an end in our region. The Ottoman Empire collapses, and the Middle East as we know it today is then shaped through a set of arrangements between France and Britain, what is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So if we move forward, without getting too deep into the historical analysis, and if we do sort of a tour d'horizon, what we're seeing is that in Lebanon, actually, it's the lowest hanging fruit because the border disputes between Israel and Lebanon are minimal. You could easily see a border agreement and a bilaterally agreed, internationally recognized border between Israel and Lebanon, which is an essential step toward a non-belligerence agreement, which then opens the way for some sort of normalization down the road and perhaps even a peace treaty a few years down. It really serves Lebanese interest. It serves Israel's interest. So the ripeness is there. Second is Syria. Again, we're seeing openness to right now indirect back channel engagement with Israel, but there is clearly openness to make political progress on the Syrian front. We're seeing in Gaza, the Americans are really pushing for what they call plus or minus the Witkoff outline, which provides for a 60-day ceasefire, release of at least more than half of the Israeli hostages, dead and alive. Meanwhile, during those 60 days, discussing the permanent status of Gaza. And if Netanyahu is willing to think about and to express some sort of a commitment to the vision of a two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, then it opens the way for normalization deal with Saudi. I would also, remind your viewership that President Trump actually put forward in his previous tenure a vision for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was called Peace to Prosperity, or simply the Trump Plan, that actually deals with all of the core issues of the conflict: territory, borders, even Jerusalem, the establishment of the realization of the principle of two nation states for two people. My bottom line here is the building blocks for a massively historical moment are on the table, and it can happen. It's not happening tomorrow, but it can happen over a period of a few months.
Right. So you seem to be extremely optimistic that something big is in the making here, and you're right.
Could be in the making.
Sure, and we keep hearing about the new Middle East, and that's something we've been talking about with some of our other guests today, this vision of a whole new region, and President Trump taking an active role in shaping it. Do you get the impression perhaps President Trump's a little more enthusiastic when it comes to drawing a line under this conflict in Gaza than perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu is?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think it's very clear and very evident. President Trump wants this war to end. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very hesitant. I could say with confidence that there would not have been the ceasefire deal of January 18 that brought back a few dozens of Israeli hostages. It would not have happened without the intervention of President Trump, and that was before the inauguration. And now, clearly, the Americans are pushing forward, and Israel is sort of being pushed into this war-ending deal in Gaza, hopefully. You have to remember that there is a far-right, radical right-wing faction within the government of Israel that is against any sort of end to the war in Gaza, because in their vision, Israel needs to permanently hold Gaza and effectively kind of remain in control there. So Netanyahu is actually also heading into a moment of big decision politically, because if he goes with what President Trump wants, which entails acknowledging a political horizon of a Palestinian state, ending the war in Gaza, all of these things will probably bring about the collapse of his government. So there is also a political line to pay attention to in Israel that goes along the diplomatic line, timeline. The other thing I want to mention is that those 60-day period during which the permanent ceasefire in Gaza will be negotiated, this is a period that brings to the fore a number of issues that are long-term issues and also connect Gaza and the West Bank. For example, the issue of security. Who will handle security in Gaza? Israel is demanding that Gaza will be demilitarized, but who will enforce the demilitarization of Gaza? Another example is economics. Part of the goal of the post-war is to have a reconstruction of Gaza. That requires revitalizing or reigniting economic activity, which requires arrangements. These arrangements are provided for in the Oslo Accords. At this moment, the Netanyahu government rejects the idea that the Oslo Accords that apply in the West Bank will be brought into Gaza. But it may be actually the path of least resistance, which is to reapply the Oslo Accords in Gaza and not to renegotiate economic arrangements. What I want to say to your viewership here is that a lot of issues that have been sidelined and ignored over the last, you could say, year and a half, and you could even say 10 years, are going to be brought forward in the next 60 days once there is a ceasefire. And that is why the diplomatic path forward along the direction that President Trump is pushing for actually may mean the end of the current Israeli government as we know it.
Right, so this is all quite risky, isn't it, for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his political survival, but it's what President Trump wants. So he's going to have to go along with it.
It is risky. It is risky, but we have to remember the following. Netanyahu could not have been at a lower point on October 7. He cannot be on a higher point after the war with Iran. And if the overarching story, we have to remember that Netanyahu is, I think, 75 years old. He's in the middle of his 8th decade of existence. He's son of a historian. He understands history. He must be planning his exit strategy. So if he did such a successful war against Iran, and then he's able to bring peace with Lebanon, arrangement with Syria, or even non-belligerence agreement with Lebanon, some sort of an agreement with Syria, normalization with Saudi, expansion of the Abraham Accord, just in exchange for ending the war in Gaza and paying some sort of a lip service for a Palestinian state, what a grand exit compared to where he was October 7, 2023. So we don't know what's in his mind, but for sure, it's very hard for a politician and a statesman like Prime Minister Netanyahu to get to a higher level than he is right now.
Okay, I mean, one thing that, strikes me from what you're saying as well is the fact that, there isn't really a post-war plan for Gaza, or at least not one we've been told about. And the fact there isn't one probably suggests that Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't really thought that far ahead, which is in itself quite telling. But what we know about what's happening in Gaza, there is a serious hunger crisis. Nearly the entire population is displaced. Most of Gaza is in ruins. A lot of people traumatized and psychologically scarred by what's happened to them. I mean, do you think Israel has here created a long-term security problem for itself by having, 2 million people just the other side of a border wall, with that amount of pent-up hatred against Israel? I mean, is that a long-term problem for Israel's security, would you say?
First of all, there is a tremendous humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's just devastating. It's unimaginable what's going on there, where you have such a huge population crushed between two forces, Israel on one side and Hamas, who continues the fight on the back of the population, underneath that, the hospitals and other places. So, and in between, there's, as you said, close to 2 million people displaced, traumatized, injured, many of them dead. It's a tragedy. And of course, it's a trauma. But my hope is, and this is sort of the peace person in me, that actually this trauma would create the conditions for a long-term resolution of the conflict, and the idea that working out our issues and coexistence between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, and hopefully also in the West Bank, this is the way to move forward. So of course there's trauma, but hopefully there's also a lesson that it's better to live alongside Israel, perhaps in peace with Israel, than keep challenging Israel over and over again. Well, it remains to be seen, but I hope that we will move in the positive direction.
Right, and ultimately President Trump has the last word on this, doesn't he? And he's got to, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to go along with it.
What we've seen is in all previous, historically, negotiations between Israel and the Arab side, not just the Palestinians, first we dealt with politics, then we moved into economics. When it came to the Abraham Accords, it was the other way around. Jared Kushner and the team that then worked for Trump first brought forward the conversation about the economic prospects of the region, and then came the political arrangements. Hopefully, in this case, it will go together, meaning at the same time that we're discussing the permanent status of Gaza, we will also think about the recreation of the conditions for the Gaza, for economic growth in Gaza, for jobs, for reconstruction. Sadly, it's a tragedy, but the level of devastation in Gaza can also bring about, the creation of modern infrastructure, the creation of the conditions for long-term economic development. Look, a lot is possible if President Trump, who is at the beginning, he's not even at the end of his first year in office, is focused on getting the political agreements in place and then building them, the reconstruction of Gaza, and then the further long-term economic development, of course, with the help of Arab countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other countries. I mean, there is, in the cards, there is a positive scenario coming out of this conflict in spite of the devastation and the tragedy.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm being told we're going to have to wrap it up there. Gidi Grinstein, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's turn now to the humanitarian angle. Well, as those talks resume, Israel continues to strike the war-torn Gaza Strip. According to local sources, Israeli forces killed at least 12 people overnight, including 6 at the Al Rimal clinic, which have been sheltering displaced Palestinians. Meanwhile, collecting aid continues to be extremely dangerous for people there in Gaza, with the UN saying that more than 500 people have been killed so far whilst trying to collect aid. Well, let's get more on this. We're joined now by the former Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations, Martin Griffiths. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Let me start by asking you, are you encouraged by the latest diplomatic efforts, in particular those being championed by President Trump?
I am. And I think it's essential that they step up, and President Trump has stepped up, I think, largely to making this happen. You only have to, and Tom, you know this better than me, you only have to look at the reports and the conversations, the interviews of the people in Gaza to know how deeply they feel the need for this, what I don't call a ceasefire, but a pause. We need to get aid in, we need to get fuel in, we need to get food in, and we need to do it properly. So if this deal can come through, at least for the pause period of 60 days, and if the aid arrangements for delivery are not poisoned by being a part of an Israeli strategy, then I think it's most welcome. It's not sufficient, but it's welcome.
Do you think it's an exaggeration to say President Trump single-handedly has the power to stop this conflict?
You know, I never really know the answer to that. It's a huge central question. It's easily said, and we've all said it. I've said it, and many people have elsewhere. But we also see so many of the examples where President Trump, with all his power and all his persistence and motivation, doesn't bring peace. But Ukraine is the obvious one. Iran, it didn't work until the bombing, and we're even in a fragile situation there. So absolute power is probably essential to stop these strategic wars, but we cannot count on it alone. We need to count on the fact that the parties agree. That's the problem in the ceasefire talks.
The United Nations has been largely sidelined, hasn't it, there in Gaza? And there is this Israeli-US-backed GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that's working there. What's your view of that entity? And why do you think it is that so many people in Gaza have been killed whilst trying to access aid from the GHF?
Well, I'm a huge critic of the GHF. I'm glad that the Swiss authorities shut that foundation down here in Geneva a few days ago. This is not what I call a humanitarian foundation. It's a foundation which is backed, planned, funded by one side, but including the allies of Israel, that is also Washington, D.C., where Mr. Trump has pledged $30 million. We see a lot of it, it's people leaving. We see a lot of reports, even from those who have been inside the foundation, of even the fact that they say that their own employees, these security people that they employ in southern Gaza, are asked to shoot and shoot to kill, and to make humanitarian delivery a war zone, as many people have said. So this is not a humanitarian operation as far as I'm concerned. And because of that, it's really important to understand what the provisions are in this potential agreement, where it's very, very unclear. It talks about humanitarian organizations, international organizations will be included, but in what way? At the moment, the inclusion has been brief, ineffectual, and tokenistic, I think, although better than nothing. So I'm a lot worried about that aspect of any pause.
But just continuing our focus on the GHF, you're quoted as saying that the GHF has been luring people to their deaths. I mean, I don't know why you think they would be doing that. And just as an extension of that question, really, when we put this to Israeli government officials, they all say this is Hamas propaganda, and it's actually Hamas that's shooting people and killing people as they line up for aid. How do you respond?
Well, fair point. We have a debate about it. The fact of the matter is that, as you said, Tom, earlier on, 500 people have been killed in this killing zone. They wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been the lure of food. They have been killed clearly, but not finally evidentially, because there's no accountable investigation, by mostly the IDF, for reasons I don't really understand. I understand the luring south because, the IDF and Israel is very clear, always has been, about the need to displace people south and eventually give them the opportunity to leave. However, on your central point, Tom, my view is, and I've said this so often since the accusations against UNRWA right after October the 7th, it's fine to accuse. Where's the evidence? Where's the independent investigation of whether it's Hamas doing this? It's easy to say that in war, but we would expect more from a government in good odor in the General Assembly, for example. And we would expect them to conduct or say yes to independent investigations to find out what the truth is. We've had enough of these claims by Israel in which they say, well, there is an investigation ongoing. We never hear the result. We never see the evidence. And that, for me, is enough to say, okay, it's an open question at least.
And of course, one part of accountability in any conflict zone would be, the journalists playing their part in tracking events, in recording events, documenting things. And of course, we're not there. We're not allowed in. I mean, how much of a difference do you think it would make having journalists from the international media on the ground in Gaza? And why do you think Israel's not letting them in?
It make a huge difference, Tom. I'm a sort of huge, maybe belated in my life, devotee of the need for media and the need for free information. It's not at odds. It's central to our international norms, and it's central to the prospects of the people of Gaza in this case. Sudan is a similar case, as you know. And the reason why I think they've been excluded in both countries is because there is an appetite not to allow the international community to see the truth. Obviously, there have been a lot of television reports by other channels, but also through you, about what's happening and testimony. The doctors have been absolutely heroic in these senses. The doctors in Gaza documentary is a vivid recent example. But without media providing the first approach to evidence, and without that evidence being transferred to an accountable process leading to the courts, whichever they are, ICJ or ICC or courts in Israel, I don't know, it's going nowhere. And it defeats hope. When you have journalists expressing the views of the people in conflict anywhere in the world, it creates hope, of course, for the future.
Sure, and it means people's voices are being heard. And if we were on the ground in Gaza, we'd be able to find out for ourselves whether those Israeli claims that UNRWA, for example, is entirely complicit with Hamas. That's something we're told time and time again by the Israelis. Again, no evidence. We have no way of knowing. But help us put that one to bed, put that idea to rest for us, will you, sir?
Look, I think that it's unequivocal. It needs more lobbying as well. It needs more international attention to the fact that the absence of media leads to suffering and tragedy and unaccountability. We need a process to do that, to go there, just as we need, by the way, Tom, in a similar vein, a process which in general, but also particularly in Gaza, provides a process for accountability for killing humanitarian aid workers. You know how much that they have lost, doctors, medical staff have lost in Gaza. That gap between aspiration, let's get journalists in, let's get aid workers protected, let's get doctors protected, and doing anything about it is yawning. It's not being done. It's one of the many things about impunity and accountability which I fear is not happening in Gaza, and as a result, there is a precedent for it not happening elsewhere.
And of course, if we were there, we'd be able to find out whether indeed Hamas was complicit in stealing food aid, which is something else we're told time and time again, but we haven't been able to find out for ourselves. We have no way of knowing. I mean, have you ever seen any conclusive evidence? I mean, obviously at the moment, that now that aid is being distributed via the GHF, perhaps less of an issue than it was. But did you ever see or hear of anything that sounded likely or plausible that indeed Hamas was trying to steal aid?
None that I've seen, right since, as you said, from the beginning. I was involved in my United Nations position in working with UNRWA on those very original accusations, and the Secretary General commissioned various inquiries, none of which produced any evidence. Israel was asked for evidence the whole time, nothing came forward. So I haven't seen it, but what I would say, or I think what we need to understand, of course, is that in this conflict, Hamas is one of the protagonists, and they have a specific and often violent strategy to achieve those objectives. Secondly, Hamas, despite IDF's many claims, are still present, of course, in the Strip, and they were the administrative power, and people in Gaza who are not necessarily Hamas sympathizers, but who may have a father who was in Hamas, reference to that documentary, or whatever, are bound to be seen as complicit with Hamas. The truth is, I believe, let's see if it's evidenced at all, is the criminal gangs and the clan criminal gangs and militias are the ones who are inevitably, perhaps, perpetrating this scene of chaos, destruction, and tragedy. All the UN stocks coming in, and pitifully few as they are, have been looted. Trucks come in and it's looted completely. Drivers are shot. And this is because of the criminal environment that the Gaza Strip has been reduced to by this appalling war. And it's understandable. We see it in lots of parts of the world, but it ain't good.
You're quoted as saying that Israel's approach to eliminating Gaza could build a generation of jihadists. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that it's natural for any people anywhere, if they survive this horrible, now long months, 17 months of war, 21 months of war, and the blockade of 17 months. If they survive it, their families, their descendants, their current children are not going to be very good at producing mutual security. And as we know, Tom, it's only mutual security that works. Thus, Israel's security is dependent on an engagement with the people of Palestine, and the region depends on that as well. Trying this, I think, hopeless task of trying to eliminate an armed group, and I've worked with armed groups for 50 years, as you know, produces jihadism, produces a new desire for revenge. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want that? So what we need to do, and hopefully President Trump and others will be actually paying some attention to this, not just on the fact that it should not fail after 60 days, as the last one did. It should address the conclusive issues, and it should address the issues of accountability. I fear, Tom, what's going to happen is we'll get a pause, but we won't get a peace.
You've described the situation as genocide. At least that's what you're quoted as having said in the past. Do correct me if I'm wrong. Who bears responsibility for that genocide, and what should happen to them?
I think responsibility for genocide is principally here the Israeli attack on the people of Palestine and Gaza. There's no question about that. There's enormous numbers of evidence and people, lawyers and others who come forward on that. There remains a dispute among lawyers, not with me, not for me, as to whether it's conclusive, and only the International Court of Justice can say this. But the fact of the matter is, it's perfectly clear this is a genocidal war in Gaza and in the West Bank increasingly, as you know. Now, what needs to be done about it, I think, is back where we started, is having a process of independent investigation and accountability and leading to indictments. It shouldn't be just a sort of a topic of diplomatic discussion or diplomatic evasion, as is so often the case. It has to be one of engagement. And why isn't that done? That's what I don't understand. Why don't we have governments in Europe and elsewhere saying we need an investigation, it should be independent, and we'll commission it?
I was just looking to see, what we'd heard from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in the last few days on the issue of Gaza. And the answer is not very much. The last quote I can find from him is his spokesperson on Thursday expressing concern and saying that Mr. Guterres, this is a third party speaking on his behalf, saying that Mr. Guterres is appalled. Why isn't someone like him more audible on this issue?
I don't know. I know him quite well, and I have a high regard for him, of course, from the time I worked for him. But somehow it's not traveling, is it? His remarks, some of which have been very cutting, very deep, but it isn't traveling. And I'm not, it's not his fault so much as the state of the United Nations and the state of state support. When we look at places in Europe, governments in Europe expressing concern, as you say, like Guterres, or it being appalling, it's not enough. We need to take action, and everybody has said action, not words, please. Concern is a dilatory and distractive way to approach the needs of the people of Palestine. And the point about the people of Palestine's needs is that these are closely watched around the world. As many people have said, what happens in Gaza won't stay in Gaza. I believe that profoundly to be true, and I think we're beginning to see evidence of that elsewhere. Sudan is another example. So don't just say it's appalling and unacceptable. Start with that, but then say what you, in this case, the Secretary General, you, in this case, Prime Minister Starmer, you, President Macron, you, Brussels, are going to do. That would be welcome. That would be a change.
Okay, so you seem to be saying that the UN Secretary General perhaps ought to be saying and doing more and having his spokesperson use the word appalling on Thursday and not a lot since then?
I think, yes, I'm saying that fundamentally, I think, but I'm also extremely aware from the time that I was in the UN and worked for him, including on Gaza, as you know, about the fact that he's very conscious that Israel has lost confidence in the UN, rightly or wrongly in my view, in terms of what's happening in Gaza. He famously said at one point publicly that the UN would not be, he would like more, but the UN would not be acceptable in the cause of reconstruction in Gaza, the future of Gaza, because of this essential veto from Israel. So I know that he's trying to balance his obligation to a member state, Israel in this case, and his obligation to the norms that created his post and his organization. We can debate, I can certainly debate whether that balance is right or wrong. But we need at the moment, I think, courage and commitment and relevance rather than a retreat into concern.
And just lastly, I mean, if we make the assumption that President Trump does have the power to put a stop to this, and you know, he is of course meeting Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House for the third time this year today, what would be your message to him? What's your appeal to President Trump?
My first message would be, make this deal happen because the people of Gaza are desperate. The attendant message is, be aware that if, as the guarantor in the draft of the agreement, you fail to make sure that it does not go beyond 60 days and that it does address the future of Gaza and the freedom of the people to choose their rulers, that will not be a success. That will not be peace. It will be a pause. And as we discussed, Tom, pause is good, but we need more.
And if he manages, do you see him winning the Nobel Peace Prize?
I think there are a lot of candidates for the Nobel Peace Prize. The doctors of Gaza would be an obvious example. I'm all in favor of everybody getting a Nobel Peace Prize if it encourages them to do the right thing. So let's hope.
Okay. Martin Griffiths, former Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you very much.
And that is all we have time for on this edition of Global News Today, and dedicated entirely to the diplomatic efforts to bring about an end to what's been 21 months of violence and conflicts in Gaza. We'll keep you posted on developments. Meanwhile, thanks for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.